late August 1944. Northern France, before sunrise, the roads are already alive. Headlights flicker through dust and fog, forming an unbroken chain stretching beyond the horizon. Engines growl in low, steady rhythm. Canvas-covered trucks roll forward, bumper to bumper, their drivers gripping the wheel through exhaustion and darkness. Somewhere miles away, German staff officers lean over maps lit by dim lamps. Pencils trace American advance lines that stretch far beyond expectation. Too far, they believe no army can move this fast for long. Not without ports, not without railroads, not without fuel. They calculate tonnage distances, consumption rates, and they dismiss what they see. On these roads, no artillery fires, no tanks clash, yet this is where the campaign is being decided. Every crate, every fuel drum, every ration box is moving toward a single purpose, keeping the advance alive at the front. Armored divisions wait, engines idle, maps are spread, orders are ready. All that stands between momentum and paralysis is what arrives next on these roads, and whether it arrives in time. By the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a new phase. The landings of early June Operation Overlord had succeeded, but only narrowly. 4 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces were trapped in the hedgerows of Normandy, advancing yard by yard under punishing fire. German defenses, though strained, remained cohesive. The battle was slow, costly, and uncertain. Then, in late July, the stalemate broke. American forces punched through German lines near Sicily. The carefully prepared breakout shattered the cohesion of German field armies in Normandy. What followed was not a gradual withdrawal, but a collapse. German units fell back in disorder. Entire formations disintegrated under air attack and relentless pressure from the ground. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Command structures fractured. For the first time since the invasion, the Allies were no longer fighting for footholds. They were racing. Supreme Allied commanders had planned for a steady, methodical advance. Their logistics assumptions were conservative by design. The expectation was that German resistance would harden as Allied armies moved inland. Instead, resistance thinned. Opportunities multiplied. Distance expanded faster than the planners' calculations. By August, Allied units were advancing across France at a speed few had anticipated. American armored columns surged eastward. Infantry followed as fast as trucks could carry them. Tactical success created a strategic problem. The front was moving faster than the supply system built to sustain it. The Allied logistical model in 1944 was anchored to the Normandy beaches. Artificial harbors had been constructed. Supplies poured ashore in enormous volume. But ports drew deep water. Ports remained out of reach. Cherbourg, when captured, was heavily damaged. Other major ports were either still in German hands or rendered unusable by systematic demolition. Railways, the backbone of European logistics, were shattered. Allied bombing campaigns had deliberately crippled French rail networks in the months before D-Day. Bridges lay twisted. Yards were unusable. What had once been an asset was now a liability. This left one option: roads. 2 German planners. This was a vulnerability. European armies had long relied on rail transport for sustained operations. Trucks were useful, but inefficient at scale. They consumed fuel, wore down quickly, and required constant maintenance. German doctrine assumed that an enemy advancing too rapidly on motor transport alone would eventually stall under its own weight. German intelligence officers watched the Allied advance with confidence. They noted the distances growing between frontline units and their beaches. They calculated fuel burn rates. They compared these figures against known Allied port capacity. Their conclusion was simple: the Americans were outrunning their supply lines. This belief shaped German decisions. Rather than committing 2 immediate counteroffensives everywhere, German commanders expected time to work in their favor. They assumed the Allied tempo would slow. Fuel shortages would force pause. Ammunition would lag. Momentum would bleed away. In theory, it was sound logic. Modern mechanized warfare is unforgiving. Tanks without fuel are steel bunkers. Trucks without spare parts become roadside debris. Infantry without rations lose combat effectiveness long before they lose ammunition. Every mile gained must be paid for in tonnage delivered. Yet what German planners underestimated was not American ambition nor American resources. They underestimated American adaptability. The U.S. Army had not crossed the Atlantic merely with divisions. It had crossed with systems procedures designed to solve problems at scale. While German doctrine emphasized efficiency within fixed structures, American doctrine emphasized improvisation under pressure. As August wore on, the distance from Normandy to the advancing front stretched to hundreds of miles. Commanders at the front demanded fuel. Commanders in the rear demanded time. Somewhere between them lay the answer to whether the advance would continue or collapse under its own success. The war, for the moment, was no longer decided by firepower alone. It was being decided by distance. Distance, in modern war, is never neutral. Every mile added to an advance multiplies demand fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. In August 1944, the U.S. Army was consuming resources at a rate unmatched in its own history. A single armored division could burn tens of thousands of gallons of fuel in a day. Every tank, truck, and half-track depended on a steady flow that could not pause without consequence. The Allied logistical plan for France had never anticipated this speed. Planners had expected a hard-fought push from the beaches toward the German frontier, with pauses built in for consolidation. Instead, German resistance fractured. The battlefield stretched eastward faster than supply depots could be moved. Belate Auguste, some American units were operating more than 300 miles from their original supply points. The U.S. Army's reliance on motor transport was now absolute. Rail lines were unusable. German demolition teams had destroyed bridges and junctions with systematic precision. Even where rails survived, locomotives were scarce and rolling stock mismatched. Repair crews worked relentlessly, but the pace of advance outstripped reconstruction. Every solution led back to trucks. Tens of thousands of vehicles were already in use, but they were never designed to operate continuously at maximum capacity. Tires shredded on French roads, engines overheated, maintenance crews struggled to keep pace. Each breakdown reduced carrying capacity further. Fuel itself became the central constraint. Gasoline moved gasoline. Trucks burned the very resource they were delivering. The longer the distance, the higher the percentage lost simply to movement. This was the mathematical reality German planners expected to assert itself. German staff officers observed these conditions with confidence. Reports emphasized Allied dependency on beach supply. Intercepts and reconnaissance suggested growing strain. The assumption was not that the Americans lacked resources, but that they lacked time to reorganize their supply structure before momentum slowed. This confidence filtered upward. German commanders believed that if they could delay long enough hold key rivers, force pause, regroup arm the Allied advance would lose coherence. The front would stabilize. Then, counterblows could be launched against overstretched units. But the Americans were already moving toward an answer that did not rely on traditional logistics. In late August, Allied supply officers confronted an unambiguous truth. Either the advance slowed dramatically, or the supply system would have to be reinvented immediately. What followed was not a carefully refined plan debated over months. It was an emergency solution born of necessity, a system built to operate without railways, without ports, and without rest. A closed-loop highway network was designated. Routes were marked. Traffic was controlled with military police at every junction. Vehicles were assigned fixed paths and schedules. Empty trucks were routed back without delay. Speed limits were enforced, not for safety, but for efficiency. The system had a name borrowed from railroad terminology, chosen for clarity and urgency. The Red Ball Express. Its purpose was simple: move supplies forward faster than the Germans believed possible. To German intelligence, this system appeared improvised and fragile. A road-based lifeline stretching hundreds of miles seemed vulnerable to disruption. Fuel convoys could be bombed. Traffic could collapse under congestion. Mechanical failure could cascade into paralysis. What German planners did not yet grasp was scale. Thousands of trucks were about to be pulled from every available unit. Drivers were reassigned. Maintenance schedules were compressed. Night driving became routine. The roads of France were about to become a continuous moving artery, one that did not sleep. At the front, commanders waited. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Orders were written but not yet issued. And behind them, on those same roads the Germans had dismissed, a logistical force was gathering momentum, relentlessly preparing to decide whether the advance would die of starvation or surge forward with renewed force. The Red Ball Express was not powered by machines alone. It was powered by people, men who drove until exhaustion blurred the road ahead, who slept beside their trucks when sleep came at all, and who learned that the war could be fought far from the sound of guns. Many of these drivers were young. Some had never driven long distances before arriving in Europe. Others had driven civilian trucks in America, unaware that their skills would soon be tested under wartime strain. They drove through blackout conditions, guided by hooded headlights and painted route markers. Dust coated their lungs. Noise never left their ears. A large number of these soldiers were African American. Segregation defined much of the U.S. Army in 1944, and combat roles were often denied to black units. Logistics became one of the few areas where manpower demands overrode prejudice. The Red Ball Express relied heavily on these soldiers' drivers, mechanics, loaders whose contribution would prove decisive, even as recognition lagged far behind. Breakdowns were constant. Tires burst. Engines failed. When trucks stopped, the clock did not. Drivers repaired what they could on the roadside. If a vehicle could not be fixed quickly, it was pushed aside. The road could not be blocked. Nothing could interrupt the flow. There was no glamour here, no battlefield glory, yet every mile driven carried fuel to tanks, food to infantry, ammunition to artillery. These men did not see the front, but the front moved because of them. They were told one thing, again and again: keep moving. And they did. From the German perspective, the situation looked familiar and manageable. European armies had long understood the limits of road-based supply. German experience in Russia had demonstrated the danger of overextended lines. Mud, distance, mechanical wear, all had punished advances that moved faster than their logistics. German officers applied these lessons universally. Reports from France seemed to confirm their expectations. Allied columns were advancing at unprecedented speed. Ports remained unavailable. Railways were destroyed. Fuel shortages were already reported at the front. German planners assumed that American command culture would enforce caution, that logistics officers would slow the advance to restore balance, that momentum would be sacrificed to sustainability. This belief-shaped German restraint. Counterattacks were delayed. Defensive lines were planned rather than rushed. Time, they believed, was on their side. What they misjudged was the American willingness to accept inefficiencies in exchange for speed. Where German doctrine emphasized optimization, American doctrine prioritized throughput. A truck that broke down after 3 days was acceptable if it delivered its cargo on the first. Where it could be repaired later, momentum could not. German intelligence tracked numbers. What it failed to measure was intent. The assumption that the Americans would behave as Europeans had behaved before them became a critical error, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. On paper, trucks were inferior to rail. They carried less, consumed more fuel, required constant maintenance. Any single truck was insignificant. But the Red Ball Express was never about individual vehicles. It was about volume. Thousands of trucks, moving continuously, created a rolling pipeline, one that could flex, reroute, and recover far faster than rail networks ever could. Roads did not need reconstruction. Bridges could be bypassed. Traffic could be redirected in hours, not weeks. This was not elegant logistics. It was brute force logistics. American industry had produced the trucks. American oil fields fed the fuel. American organizational culture accepted waste as the price of speed. Together, these elements formed something German planners had not faced before, a supply system that behaved more like an industrial process than a military tradition. The trucks kept coming, and with every mile they covered, The assumptions underpinning German confidence weakened quietly, steadily under the weight of reality. For Georges Patton, speed was not a preference, set was doctrine. He believed that hesitation killed more soldiers than risk, and that momentum, once gained, had to be exploited without pause. After the breakout from Normandy, his Third Army moved with a velocity that startled allies and enemies alike. Towns fell in hours. German units were bypassed rather than destroyed. The advance was designed to unbalance the enemy faster than they could react. But Patton's tempo carried a price. Fuel requests from his headquarters became relentless. His armored spearheads consumed gasoline at a rate that strained even the most optimistic estimates. When fuel failed to arrive, units halted not because of resistance, but because engines ran dry. For Patton, this was intolerable. Pressure flowed backward through the command structure. Logistics officers were urged, then ordered, to find solutions. Traditional constraints were dismissed. If supplies could move faster by bending rules, the rules would bend. If trucks wore out, replacements would be found. What mattered was keeping the advance alive while the enemy reeled. Patton understood something the Germans did not yet grasp. A rapidly retreating enemy is most vulnerable not when pressed cautiously, but when denied time to recover. Fuel was not simply sustenance, it was initiative. The Red Ball Express became, in effect, an extension of Patton's command. Every convoy that arrived on time translated directly into ground gained. Every delay risked handing the Germans the pause they needed. Behind the front lines, the war took a different form. Drivers operated under constant pressure. Convoys ran day and night. Sleep was fragmented. Fatigue became normal. Accidents were frequent, yet the system endured because stopping was not an option. The road itself. By late August 1944, the Red Ball Express was no longer an experiment. It was an operation running at full strain. Routes were locked in. Traffic flowed in one direction only. Military police stood at every major junction, enforcing movement with absolute authority. Convoys did not stop for convenience. They stopped only for necessity, and even then, briefly, trucks moved in columns, spaced to prevent pileups, timed to maintain constant throughput. The numbers escalated rapidly. Thousands of vehicles were committed. Tens of thousands of tons of supplies moved everyday fuel first, then ammunition, rations, spare parts. Gasoline arrived in bulk, often in 5-gallon cans, stacked by the hundreds. Drivers unloaded, turned a Harun, and headed back without delay. The system was imperfect. Accidents clogged shoulders. Engines failed under continuous strain. Trucks were cannibalized for parts. But the flow never stopped. If one vehicle dropped out, another filled the gap. At the front, the effect was immediate. Fuel deliveries that had been sporadic became dependable. Armored units that had paused restarted their engines. Infantry formations received rations without delay. Artillery ammunition stocks stabilized. What had threatened to become a logistical collapse instead became a logistical surge. German intelligence reports began to change tone. What had been described as overextension now appeared sustained. Intercepts confirmed continued American movement. Reconnaissance observed columns advancing without pause. Defensive positions were outflanked faster than they could be reinforced. The assumption that fuel shortages would force operational pauses proved false. For the first time, German commanders recognized that the Americans had solved the problem they were expected to fail. The road network, once dismissed as insufficient, had become a reliable artery. The very factor believed to limit the advance was now enabling it. At headquarters, maps were updated with alarming frequency. Front lines shifted daily. Requests for reinforcements increased. Defensive plans were rewritten under pressure. Meanwhile, American columns pressed forward. Patton's units did not wait for perfection. They moved when fuel arrived, sometimes within hours of depletion. Orders emphasized speed, exploitation, and relentless pursuit. German formations were given no time to regroup. Retreat turned into flight. The Red Ball Express had done more than sustain the advance. It had changed the tempo of the war, and with each mile gained, it became clear that the moment German generals had scoffed at was now unfolding before them, uncontrolled irreversible, and accelerating. As September approached, the consequences of the Red Ball Express became impossible to dismiss. American armored columns were no longer advancing in bursts, they were advancing in waves. When one unit paused to refuel, another passed through and pressed on. German defensive lines hastily assembled along rivers and crossroads were often bypassed before they were fully occupied. The tempo of movement denied the defenders time to establish depth or cohesion. For George's Patton, this was the moment he had anticipated. Fuel deliveries arrived just fast enough to keep his spearheads alive. Every gallon that reached the front translated into miles gained. Orders emphasized forward pressure above all else. Tanks rolled until engines overheated. Crews slept beside vehicles, waiting for the next resupply. German commanders now faced a dilemma they had not planned for. The anticipated pause never came. Fuel shortages, expected to paralyze the Americans, instead appeared to be a temporary inconvenience to one that vanished as quickly as it emerged. Each time German units believed the enemy would halt, new formations appeared beyond their flanks. Attempts to counter this momentum failed. Luftwaffe attacks on convoys were sporadic and largely ineffective. Air superiority belonged to the Allies. Roads could not be interdicted at scale. What should have been a fragile lifeline proved resilient under pressure. German field reports began to reflect urgency. Language shifted from confidence to concern. The American advance was described as unusually rapid, unpredictable, difficult to contain. The logistics failure that had been expected to buy time was instead accelerating defeat. The Red Ball Express had become more than supply, it had become surprise. By sustaining continuous motion, the Americans denied the Germans the one resource they desperately needed: time. Every delay favored the attacker. Every successful convoy extended the imbalance. In practical terms, the Red Ball Express transformed logistics into an offensive weapon. It allowed armored forces to strike deeper than doctrine suggested was safe. It allowed commanders to exploit weakness immediately rather than consolidate cautiously. It turned roads into arteries of power. German generals no longer scoffed. They adjusted plans in haste, recognizing that the Americans had unlocked something fundamental, an ability to convert industrial capacity directly into operational momentum without waiting for traditional infrastructure. The battlefield had shifted. The decisive factor was no longer who held the strongest defensive line, but who could move, supply, and adapt faster than the enemy could react. And now, the consequences of that realization were unfolding. By mid-September 1944, the immediate effects of the Red Ball Express were visible across the Western Front. American forces had advanced hundreds of miles beyond the Normandy beaches in a matter of weeks. Entire regions of France were liberated with minimal set-piece battles, not because German resistance vanished, but because it was repeatedly outpaced. Defensive lines were formed, outflanked, and abandoned in rapid succession. What the Germans had hoped would become a controlled withdrawal instead unraveled into continuous retreat. Operational reports reflected the shift. German units were increasingly short of fuel, ammunition, and cohesion, not because their supply lines were longer, but because their planning assumptions had failed. They had prepared for an Allied pause that never came. Each day, the Americans continued moving erased another opportunity to regroup. For the Allies, the success of the Red Ball Express stabilized a dangerously fragile moment. Fuel shortages had not disappeared, but they were managed. Supplies arrived unevenly, sometimes just in time. Times barely enough but enough to keep pressure constant. This continuity prevented the Germans from re-establishing a defensible operational rhythm. The psychological effect was significant. American commanders gained confidence in their ability to sustain deep operations. Logistics officers, once viewed as a limiting factor, were now seen as enablers of maneuver. The front no longer dictated the pace alone, the supply system actively shaped it. German command correspondence from this period reveals growing alarm. The belief that American forces would be forced to halt was replaced by recognition that the enemy could adapt faster than expected. Defensive plans were revised repeatedly. Requests for reinforcements increased. Strategic options narrowed. Yet the Red Ball Express was never intended as a permanent solution. The strain on vehicles was severe. Breakdown rates climbed. Tire shortages worsened. Drivers operated at the edge of exhaustion. The system functioned because it had to not, because it was sustainable indefinitely. Even as it succeeded, planners searched for alternatives. Reopening ports, repairing railways, shortening supply distances, but by the time those longer-term solutions came online, the critical window had passed. The Ball Express had already done its work. It had preserved momentum at the moment when momentum mattered most. It had turned what could have been an operational pause into a continued surge. And it had demonstrated, in real time, that modern warfare could be decided far from the front by those who ensured the front never had to wait. The full consequences of this realization would extend beyond France, shaping decisions yet to come. As the campaign moved deeper into Europe, the Ball Express began to wind out not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded. Ports were gradually reopened. Rail lines were repaired and brought back into service. Supply distances shortened as depots moved forward. The emergency system that had once carried the weight of the entire American advance was no longer required at full scale. But its impact endured. Allied commanders now understood, in concrete terms, that logistics was not merely a support function. It was an operational instrument. The Ball Express had demonstrated that supply systems could be designed for speed rather than efficiency, for flexibility rather than permanence. This lesson would shape Allied planning for the remainder of the war. German post-war analyses acknowledged the miscalculation. The assumption that the Americans would be constrained by traditional European logistics proved incorrect. What German doctrine treated as wasteful the use of massive numbers of trucks, the acceptance of mechanical attrition, the prioritization of speed over longevity had become decisive. In modern war, the Americans had shown, endurance was not always about conservation. Sometimes it was about momentum. The Ball Express also left a quieter legacy. The soldiers who drove those roads returned home with little recognition. Their work lacked the visibility of frontline combat, yet without them, the advance would have stalled. Their contribution, long overlooked, gradually gained recognition as historians re-evaluated how wars are actually won. By the time the fighting shifted toward Germany's borders, the outcome in Western Europe was no longer in doubt. The enemy had been denied the pause it needed. Initiative had been lost and could not be regained. What remained was the understanding that a war could hinge not on a single battle, but on the ability to keep moving when movement itself became decisive. The roads of France do not appear in victory parades. They carry no monuments to strategy or sacrifice. Yet in the late summer of 1944, those roads became one of the most important battlefields of the war. German generals believed the Americans would be defeated by distance. They expected fuel shortages to slow the advance, logistics to impose restraint, and momentum to fade under its own weight. These expectations were grounded in experience because until then, they had always been true. What changed was not technology alone, but mindset. The Ball Express proved that modern war could be sustained not by perfect efficiency, but by relentless movement. It showed that an army willing to accept wear, waste, and exhaustion could convert industrial strength directly into battlefield advantage. In doing so, it transformed supply from a limitation into a weapon. For the soldiers at the front, this meant engines that kept running when they should have stopped. For those behind the lines, it meant nights without sleep, roads without silence, and a responsibility that carried the weight of entire armies. The lesson endured beyond 1944. Wars are often remembered by their battles, their names, their dates, their casualties. But beneath every advance lies a quieter truth. Victory belongs to those who can move, adapt, and sustain effort when others expect collapse. In France, the Americans did not merely outrun the enemy, they outran the enemy's assumptions. And on those uncelebrated roads, history turned one convoy at a time.